Hello everybody, here's Anthony Peake again for another edition of A Peek Behind the Curtain. Today I'm going to be carrying on a little bit on the topics I've been discussing in the previous two editions of A Peek Behind the Curtain, but I'm going to be really playing more on the Peake elements. The reason being, today I want to talk a little bit about the English writer Mervyn Peake, and a little bit of a background family story on this as well. So roll back to around about 1969, 1970. And I'm a fifth year at Wirral Grammar School. And one day I'm chatting away to somebody and somebody starts calling me Mervyn. And I wasn't quite sure why this person was doing this. And I challenged them on it. And they said, have you no idea that your namesake, there's a writer called Mervyn Peake? And I checked out and I found that there was an edition of a Mervyn Peake novel in the school library. So I took it home and I read it. Now, I had comparatively recently finished reading Lord of the Rings. And I found this book to be very, very similar, but I used the term, it was like Lord of the Rings with cobwebs, is the only way I can describe it. And the storyline, basically, it's part of a trilogy. There were 3 novels written by Mervyn Peake. Well, there were other novels written, but the Gormenghast trilogy is the thing he's best known for. And these involve 3 novels. Titus Groan, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone. And the novels are basically, when it starts, it's this castle, very feudal castle, and all the people live within this castle, and it's full of characters, and it's a timeless location, so you're not sure whether it's medieval, whether it's the Dark Ages, or whether it's in the far future and civilization has gone backwards, as it were, from a technological situation we're involved in. But basically, it's the adventures of a young man called Steerpike. And Steerpike, how he comes up from being somebody in the kitchens to somebody extremely powerful. And behind it all is also Titus Groan, who is the son of the Lord Groan, who's the lord of the manor, as it were, the master of Gormenghast Castle. But I'm not really going to be going into the storyline in any great detail at the moment. But if you want to read it, it is well worth reading. All 3 novels are well worth reading. Titus Alone is a little bit stranger, for one reason or another, which I won't ruin it for you. But if you want to live in a novel in a really bizarre world, the Gormenghast trilogy is well worth reading. But what was peculiar was, I took out the book from the library and my father picked it up one afternoon and he said, "Oh, that's interesting." He said, "A very interesting novel." And he started thumbing through it and he said, "That name rings a bell for me." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, at the end of the Second World War, my father was in the medical corps of the British Army, specifically the 8th Army. And his war had been a very interesting one. He was a professional soldier when the war broke out. And he'd been down in Palestine, he'd been in Egypt, and then he was at El Alamein, for instance. And one of the tales he told me was when he was at El Alamein, they were lying in the darkness waiting to attack the town of El Alamein in Libya. And he was explaining to me, and he said, we suddenly heard a rustling sound. We're all lying down ready to go in. And there were these guys crawling over us. And there were a lot of troops from India, and they had knives in their teeth, and they were actually going in, whether they were Gurkhas or whatever, I'm not quite sure. But I remember him describing how terrifying this was, how scary these guys were. And they went across into the German lines, and all they heard was screams as these guys did the most amazing things or awful things to the German defenders. And my father told me that, a few minutes before, the guns opened up, and he said it was the biggest barrage he'd ever heard. But that's not the background story. The background story is that as his war developed, he was then at D-Day. And he also claimed quite something interesting. He said that on D-Day he'd been over and back the day before, I think it was the 6th of June, 1944. And he claimed that he'd been over and back on the 5th of June, which I always found quite interesting and peculiar, but I never really pursued that with him. But he was involved in the medical corps, and the Eighth Army fought their way through. And they were told that they were going to see something really, really horrific, and they were British soldiers, and they needed to keep their cool on it. And effectively what happened was they were the first, the advance force that was in Belsen concentration camp. And as he said, some of the horrors he saw there were just unbelievable. And indeed, he used to wake up screaming in the middle of the night, the things he'd seen. He never recovered from it. But while he was there, he said that one day he noticed there was a young English guy that was doing drawings of the site and the bodies and everything else as well. And he got chatting to him. And they exchanged ideas and thoughts about how awful this all was. And he discovered that this guy had actually been brought up as the son of a missionary in China. And he had become an artist. He was a professional artist. And quite to their surprise, they discovered they both had the same surname. My father's name was Eric Peake, and the other guy was called Mervyn Peake. Now, I found this astonishing, as did my father, and he said, I wonder if it's the same man. So I did a little bit of research, and I discovered that, yes, indeed, it was. And my father said we did discuss whether the fact we could be related in some distant way. So anyway, roll forward many, many years. My father died in 1987, and never really talked about the subject ever again. But I became very interested in Mervyn Peake over the years, and I read a number of his other novels. I mean, for instance, the wonderful Mr. Pie, which is based on, I think it's Sark in the Channel Islands, and the eponymous character, Mr. Pie, is a very saintly individual, and he starts growing wings, and he's becoming an angel. And they did a TV series of this, probably in the very early 1980s. And I can't remember who played Mr. Pie in the TV series, but it was very, very, quite a famous actor. And it was very interesting. It was very beautifully filmed as well. It was very intriguing, kind of quasi-magical. We do ourselves down in this country when we say we don't do things like magical realism. Of course we do. We just called it different things. I mean, if he'd been Latin American and had been Jorge Borges or somebody of that nature, people would have been raving about his novels. But because he was British, so in some way we're not really capable of doing these kind of things, which is curious and very strange, because that's not true at all. But suffice to say, there was this TV series, but also after that, many years later, they also did a TV series based on Gormenghast, and they did a very good TV version of it, which if you look out for it, it was very, very good. There was a young Irish actor playing Steer Pike, and there were a lot of other famous individuals that played various other roles. I think the lady who played one of the characters in EastEnders, Dot Cotton, the actress who played Dot Cotton, I think she played Irma Prunesqualler, who was one of the characters in Gormenghast and Titus Groan. And what is intriguing in that is that all the characters and the names are just very, very interesting. He obviously loved playing with weird names and strange names. But the TV series was comparatively successful, and it turned a lot of people on to Mervyn Peake's work. But roll forward again to around about 2010, 2011, maybe 2012. I noticed by chance that there was an exhibition of Mervyn Peake's paintings in London. And I decided that I might be going to see this exhibition. But I needed to know a little bit more information about the exhibition. So I phoned up the place where the exhibition was taking place. And I explained who I was and that I was interested in coming along to the exhibition. And I then turned round and I said, who am I speaking to? And he said, oh, you're actually speaking to Sebastian Peake, who is Mervyn Peake's son. I'm Mervyn's son. And I said, good Lord, this is astonishing. I said that my name is Peake as well, and that's the reason I'm interested in Mervyn and everything else as well. And then I remembered my father's story about Belson. And I turned round to Sebastian and I said, did your father ever talk about meeting another guy when he was at Belson in 1945? Did he mention it? And he said, yes, I do recall him talking about this. A little guy from Liverpool who was in the medical corps. And I said, yeah, that was my father. And he then said, it was interesting because my father did some research and he discovered that there was a dim and distant relationship between the two of them. But they never spoke because, of course, in those days, it wasn't really, people didn't communicate in the same way unless they swapped addresses. And in a horrific situation like Belson, I think the last thing people were doing was looking for friends and family when they were dealing with such atrocities and everything else as well. Of course, these days with social media and everything, it would be quite easy for them to remain in contact. And because they were a very different social class as well. My father was just a working class guy from Birkenhead, whereas Mervyn Peake, was a good deal more, dare I say it, cultured. And whether they would have necessarily gone on is beside the point. But clearly there was a relationship there. So that really intrigued me. And Sebastian and I chatted. And Sebastian turned around and said, it would be really interesting if we could meet up. And I said, that would be absolutely wonderful. I said, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time, we can meet up. And we agreed to do that. And we left it for 2 or 3 weeks. And then I heard that Sebastian died of a heart attack before we had the opportunity to meet. And it was profoundly sad because it would have been a very interesting storyline to follow there, and pursue that. Because at that time, I think I'd written 3 books. So, I was in a position that, I had something to share with him and everything else as well. But one of those things. But as I say, Mervyn Peake is very well worth pursuing and reading his work if you haven't already done so. But I then started to think about various other things, because as we know, this peek around behind the curtain is very much me just rambling. It's not scripted. I have a vague idea what I'm going to talk about, but I just go off on tangents and everything. So some of the information I may give is incorrect, which I make apologies for, but because it's not scripted, it's all just coming, it's as I said in the first one, stream of consciousness. But it reminded me of another, in a very bizarre way, how my mind works. But it reminded me again of the Wirral. Why, I don't know particularly. But it reminds me of a lot of Wirral writers, which I talked about last time. But it also reminded me of something I discovered that was a really fascinating story that I feature in my first book. And in my first book, what I was trying to do was to get across the idea that people who have precognitive abilities, famous people from history that supposedly were able to see the future, were very effective in predicting things that were going to happen in their own lifetime, in their own future, if I'm making sense. And the reason I argue this is that if my Damon Eidolon hypothesis is correct, and that we all, our higher self, our Damon, is a version of us who's lived our lives many times. So in which case, that means that Damon, that being, has already lived your life many times. And therefore, within its memory stores are events it will experience in your own future. So in other words, your Damon, you're, say, 30 years of age. Your Damon has been 30 years of age as you many, many times, but has also been 45 and 50 and 60 and 70, and maybe older, depending upon how your life pans out. In which case, that Damon's memories are of future events. Now, what I argue in the book is that there are circumstances when people's doors of perception are more open. The communication channels, I would argue, along the corpus callosum in the brain, between the non-dominant and dominant hemispheres are such that there is leakage through. What I call demonic consciousness leaks through. So in dream sequences or in altered states of consciousness, the everyday person, the Eidolon, can access the knowledge and the data banks available to the daemon. In which case, there can be times when the leakage coming through can be of events that have yet to take place. And of course, we know that one of the major areas that precognition takes place is during dreams, or during hypnagogic or hypnopompic states. It's during that dream state, it's during the liminal state. And I argue that's when the doors of perception, to coin a phrase from William Blake and then taken by Aldous Huxley, the doors of perception are open, which allows this information to come through. Now, we know in dreams that what dreams do is they take themes and they place them in kind of story patterns. So the dreams will have within them future events which will be embroidered in a dreamscape in one way or another. Now that's what happens, I think, with normal precognitive dreaming. I also argue this is what happens in a déjà vu state, when suddenly the doors of perception are instantaneously open for a second, and you remember doing a particular event or seeing a particular thing taking place or meeting a particular person or being in a particular location. And it's as if you know what's going to happen next, because in demonic consciousness, you do know what's going to happen next because your daemon has already experienced that set of circumstances. So that's how I explain déjà vu. I'll probably chat about that in greater detail in the future. But the point we have here is that I argue that there are certain famous people in history who were famous for their abilities to foresee the future. And in my first book, Is There Life After Death? And I think I extrapolated on this in my third book, The Labyrinth of Time. But I argue that there are certain seers and prophets or whatever from the past who seem to be very accurate in their predictions of the future. And I give a specific example of the life of Nostradamus, Michael de Notre Dame. And Nostradamus, if you look at his works, as you probably will know, he wrote a series of quatrains, 4-line verses, and he wrote, I think, around 400 of them, quatrains, hundreds, and I think there were 4 sections. And in these 4-line verses, they are written in Latin and French, and also various other old languages, and there's puns in them and there's anagrams in them. And the argument is that he was doing this because he didn't want to fall foul of the Inquisition. So he in dream states would see the future. Or as he argued, it was very peculiar how he described how he saw the future. And he mentions in one of the quatrains having a tripod and maybe having smoke or some kind of hallucinogenic substance burning so he could imbue this to put him into an altered state of consciousness, or as I would argue, to open his doors of perception and allow him to access demonic perception. But one of the lines he also says that the being is next to me. Now, that I found absolutely fascinating. Now, even my memory, I can't remember the exact quatrain where he says this, but I do quote it in the book. And he said that my brother or my something is next to me. Now, I'd argue again, this is evidence, again, of sensing the daemon. Sensing that the daemon is here. And again, going off on a tangent, if you are interested in the work of Michael Persinger, who was a psychologist who researched in Sudbury in Ontario in Canada, and he invented something he called the God helmet, which was effectively an adapted American football helmet, which they put magnets in to create electromagnetic fields. And they placed the magnets over the temporal lobes of people. And when they did this, people had what was called a sensed presence. They sensed that there was somebody else in the room with them, or there was somebody else in their mind with them. Now, I'd argue again that is absolutely correct, because nobody's really explained why the sensed presence and how Persinger had success in this. Now, I'd argue I can explain that. It's because he was stimulating the temporal lobes, which is, again, the areas that seem to me that the doors of perception are particularly opportunity to be open. And within the temporal lobes, again, the daemon may manifest. Because, of course, temporal lobe epilepsy, as I write about, is another area another neurological situation whereby demonic and eidolonic thought patterns come together in one way or another. So people sense the sense presence. I believe that's the daemon. Okay, and ordinarily we don't know the daemon is there because we're not supposed to. But under certain circumstances, such as deep hypnotism and times of stress, near-death experiences, these kind of things, the daemon comes to the fore. Now, so going back then, we've gone to discuss Michael Persinger, and I'll probably discuss Persinger's work in greater detail in the future. But going back then to Nostradamus, and he said the way somebody was standing next to him, I'd argue this is where the information came from for his quatrains and his future predictions. Now, if you look at his predictions of the future, he was very, very good and very precise at events that were about to take place in his future lifetime, i.e. before he died. I'll give an example. One of the most famous ones was, that I'm paraphrasing here, but the line is something like, the young lion shall vanquish the old on field of combat with eyes in a cage of gold, on field of combat with eyes destroyed, will take 3 days to die. It's somewhere in those lines. Now that's the line. Now, what was extraordinary was that one of the French kings, one of the Henrys, Henry IV, maybe, I'm not quite sure which French king it was, but in the future of when after Nostradamus had written this, there was a jousting competition. And there was a young French knight. I think his name was Montgomery. I may be wrong on this, but it was something like that. And he was a young French knight. And when the horses were coming together with the lances, Montgomery, or whoever the name, the guy, the Scottish guy, lifted his lance up slightly too high, and it shattered the visor of the king, or of the prince, or whoever it was. And his visor was made of gold. And it destroyed his eyes. And 3 days later, he died. So remember what Nostradamus said? The young lion, i.e. the Scottish guy, shall vanquish the old on field of combat in a cage of gold, eyes destroyed, will take 3 days to die. Now, that is an extraordinary prediction. It is very powerful and it's very accurate. It's not the normal Nostradamus thing of actually making things, using dripping names from various areas. I'll give an example of this, that a lot of people got very excited when they said that Nostradamus saw Hitler. Because in one of the quatrains, it says somewhere in the lines, Hister, the Knight of the Crooked Cross. But Hister, he was talking about a river. I think Hister is the old name for the River Danube. And the Knights of the Crooked Cross, it wasn't just Hitler. So, just because Hister sounds like Hitler doesn't mean it is. Another thing that people confuse a lot is he uses a term Amorica quite a lot in his quatrains. And people understand that to be America. It's not. Amorica is the old name for Brittany. Amor, Amorok. Amor is land of the sea, so that there are two places in Brittany. There's Arcoed, which is the land of the forest, which is inland, and Armor, which is the land of the coast, the land of the sea. And of course, you just add the CI to make it a place, so Amorica. So he wasn't talking about America. And remember, there was one famous statement where he said, in the great lands of America, three brothers will come to pass, two alone are born to rule. Two alone are born to rule, but all will die before their hour. Now, again, anybody who's into music will know where I've got that quotation from. I'm not quoting Nostradamus here. I'm quoting a guy called Al Stewart, who was, and still is, a very, very talented British folk singer-songwriter. And in 1974, maybe 75, he brought out an album called Past, Present and Future. And on that album, there is this incredible 6 or 7 minute track called Nostradamus. And in it, he paraphrases a lot of the work done by a lady called Erica Cheetham, who was the definitive researcher on Nostradamus, brought a couple of books out on the subject. And again, Cheetham's work is very interesting because particularly because she was writing in the 80s, you can see how she would have attuned Nostradamus's predictions to to accommodate the world that she was expecting to develop. Whereas now when you see people looking at Nostradamus, they're now moulding it differently. Like, in the great lands of America, three brothers are born to pass it. Again, as I said, it's Amorica, not America. And of course, three didn't rule. So he was technically wrong about that. I also remember being very, very worried when I was at university. Myself and my friend Bob Steen were very interested in Nostradamus. And one of the few Nostradamus predictions that actually gave a date was one for 1999, the famous year that all people making predictions love, from Edgar Cayce onwards. They all love 1999 because it's obviously the end of the millennium, and therefore millennium fever that starts to take off, as we know happened with the millennium bug and various other things. But he said, Nostradamus says that in 1999, I think it was October 1999, there would be effectively the Antichrist would reappear. And I think he said something along the lines, the great city would burn at 49 degrees. And again, people got excited about that because the great new city, he calls it, and the city of hollow, I think it was the term he used, the city of hollow mountains, which people thought were skyscrapers, and the city burning at 49 degrees. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that New York is actually at 49 degrees. I think it's further up, but I'm not sure. I think it might be 45 or something. So even that was not actually correct. But what Nostradamus does, he allows people to really fill in the details, in one way or another. And of course, we are waiting now for the great Antichrist, and I think Nostradamus called the Antichrist Mabuse. And I've not heard of anybody of that name in recent years come up. But there was one though that I did find quite fascinating, and it was a prediction that an issue would happen in Persia, and that the problem or the issue or something would come out of Paris. Now, I don't know if you remember back in 1979, I think it was, when the Ayatollah Khomeini came back with the Iranian Revolution. He was based in Paris, and he flew back to Tehran to cause the revolution and the overthrow of the Shah and everything. And I did find that quite intriguing in many ways. But coming back to my point, though, so Nostradamus did seem to be accurate during his period of his life, and that is very much in keeping with my cheating the ferryman hypothesis. But I also discussed two other individuals who were also famous for making predictions in their own lifetime, and one was Mother Shipton, who was a seer in the 13th, 14th century, I think, and she lived in Knaresborough in North Yorkshire, a place quite close to where I lived for a time. I used to live in Harrogate in North Yorkshire, and I used to, on a Sunday, it was really nice to go to Knaresborough, a beautiful place. And Mother Shipton's cave is still there. And again, a lot of her predictions seem to be comparatively accurate during her lifetime. But as soon as they die, their predictions go off ski-whiff. Now, this is, again, because my Damon argument is that it's future memory. But to get round to where I'm going with this is that I want to talk about specifically the third character. And it's a guy called Robert Nixon. Now, Robert Nixon was a farm boy of some description in a place called Vale Royal. And Vale Royal is effectively, some of you may have heard of in Cheshire, a place called Delamere Forest. Well, Vale Royal is in that area. It's Delamere Forest kind of area. And in 1485, I think it was, forgive my history, I'm not a medieval scholar, medieval historian, and my history started with the Tudors, which effectively this is when it did start. But I think it was 1485, something like that, when the new king, Henry VII, had defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field, and he sent out people round the country to just let people know that there was a new king, because in those days, they didn't have internet, they didn't have newspapers, they didn't have communication. The only way things got round were by word of mouth. So Henry Tudor, Henry VII, needed the people to know that the Tudor monarchy, the Lancastrians, had won the War of the Roses, and there was a new family ruling, the Tudors. And his men went out in various parts of the country, and they got to Vale Royal in Cheshire. And they were about to announce and say there's a new king, and the people in Vale Royal already knew. This astonished the people that had been sent out to send the messages, the royal messengers. And they asked, how do you know that there's a new king? And they said, oh, because of Robert Nixon. Now, Robert Nixon was the village idiot, effectively. He was mentally challenged, but he was a strange character. And he was known for predicting when animals were going to be sick and things that would go wrong in the village. But there was one particular afternoon in 1485, if I've got the year right, when suddenly he starts running around the field and he's gesticulating and he's saying, up at him, Henry, down, Richard is down, Richard is down, Henry is back, and Richard is dead, we have a new king, we have a new king. So he was clearly seeing, in his mind's eye, the Battle of Bosworth Field taking place many miles away. I think it was in Warwickshire or so, Leicestershire or somewhere, whereas Cheshire is a good, 100 miles or so away from that area. So when the message gets back to Henry VII, Henry is intrigued by this and sends the messengers back and said, I want him at my court. I'm interested to have this man involved as a seer and as a, it'd be useful for me if I can see the future or have somebody that can tell me the future. So he sends his men up to pick up Nixon and bring him back down to London. Nixon knew they were coming and said to the villagers in Vale Royal, please hide me. They're going to take me away. They're going to take me to London. And if I go to London, I'll starve to death. Please don't let me go. So when the people arrived in Vale Royal again to offer him this opportunity to go down to London, they couldn't find him. And eventually they talked the locals into allowing them to speak to him. And they spoke to Nixon and they said, look, if we will guarantee, the king will guarantee that you will have a cook for you at any time you want food, you can just have it, you can eat. Whatever time, day or night, you can do it. Will you now come down? And he agreed. And he goes down to London. Now, when he's down in London, he became a real nuisance because he was asking for food all the time. And the cooks were getting really fed up with him. And one day they decided that he was such a nuisance, they locked him in the scullery. And that was the day that Henry VII decided to change castles. And you guess what happened? They forgot that Nixon was in the scullery and he starved to death, exactly as he predicted it would be. Now, that is an extraordinary story. And effectively, there's an interesting argument here of, was that Nixon's daemon? Because if it was Nixon's daemon, he would have witnessed the fact that his eidolon starved to death. So that suggests to me that the daemon survives longer than any individual eidolon because it's there to witness the death of its eidolon or the death circumstances of its eidolon. And again, many of you will know that in my book on Philip K. Dick, I did something similar. I discovered that Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer, also predicted his own death. And again, I'm the only writer that has ever written about this in the way I do. Another writer has referenced it, but not in the way I reference it. And what happened was Philip K. Dick, no writer has referenced it the way I have done because I have more information than the other writers on the background of this. In it would have been, I think, around about 74, 75. Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer, opened up correspondence with a lady called Gloria, I think it's Gloria Krentz Bush. I think Gloria or Claudia. It could be Claudia. Claudia Krentz Bush, who I think lived in Boise, Idaho or somewhere. Or is Boise, Montana? That doesn't really matter. But anyway, he used to send her letters. Now, as part of my research on my biography of Philip K. Dick, I read all of his letters, or all the letters I could get hold of. They're in bound copies. They're really quite fascinating to read. And it gives you a really background to his life and his experiences at that time. And it also catches him out on a few fibs, which maybe I will discuss in a future reference, because every other writer has cited certain things that happened in Phil's life that I know were not true, because the letters prove they weren't true. But you still read even now people making the statements such as Phil diagnosed that his son Christopher had an undiagnosed inguinal hernia, and the doctors were amazed as to how he knew this. Well, he didn't actually predict it at all. He wasn't even involved in it. And it was Tessa that took Christopher to the hospital, Phil's wife at the time, or Phil's fifth wife, Phil's final wife, who was Christopher's mother. But again, an aside, as I do. But what happened was Tessa and Phil, well, just the letter first. I came across this letter, and next time I talk, I will have it with me, so I'll show you exactly what the letter says so you can see it for yourself. But in the letter, it's a typewritten letter. And I managed to get hold, because what happened was Bush decided to sell some of the letters, and some of them were posted online for people to look at and buy. And I managed to get a screen grab of one of them. And it's a typed letter, because Phil used to type his letters, but there's handwritten sections on the side. And he turns around in the letter, and he's describing the way in which he turns around, and I'm paraphrasing again, but he says something along the lines of, last night I asked the entity to come to me, because his daemon was manifesting in his life. He called it the entity, he called it Starbright, Firebright, and various other names, and Valis. And if you read his novels, Valis, you'll know what I mean by this. And of course, he was preoccupied with being more than one person. I mean, in one of his books, he has two characters, one called Philip K. Dick, who is a science fiction writer. Ubik, I think it is a science fiction writer. And he has another character called Horselover Fat. And these two are two characters in the novel, until you realise they're not two characters. It's his daemon and his eidolon. Horselover Fat is a very clever pun. Horselover in Greek is Philhippus, or Philohippus, and Dick is German for fat. So Horselover Fat is Philip Dick. Okay? So here he's giving some kind of clues about this kind of psychological duality he has. And again, he was preoccupied with doubles. He was preoccupied like various other writers have been over the years, from Dostoevsky onwards. And again, I argue that this is because they are writing about how their lives work. Okay? But so Phil says he has these series of, I asked the entity to talk to show itself. Then I saw a handful of stark hypnagogic images. I saw undersea cities. And then I saw one stark image. Lying between a sofa and a coffee table was a portly middle-aged man lying on his stomach. And then he handwrites in the corner. And he handwrites. And he says, Gloria, I think I'm becoming precognitive. Now, that's a curious thing to do, isn't it? Why did he say precognitive? Why did he handwrite that in rather than put it in the letter? But he didn't. Roll forward to 1982. Phil and Tessa had split up, and Phil had become part of a reading group. And I think it's every Tuesday they used to meet up and discuss novels and things. One particular Tuesday, Phil didn't turn up. And they were worried. So the next morning, a group of his friends, including a science fiction writer who wrote the Mandelbrot Gate, oh, I can't remember his name now. But anyway, I contacted him over this, so we verified that this was because he was involved in it. He and a group of other people went back round to Phil's house the next morning, the Wednesday morning, and they knocked on the door and there was no answer. So they broke in to find Phil in the living room, lying on his stomach between a sofa and a coffee table. He died, I think, on the Saturday. He'd had a huge stroke. Here we saw Philip K. Dick seeing his own death circumstances. This is exactly the same as Robert Nixon did. Now again, it means that Philip K. Dick's daemon, Valis, Firebright, whatever he wants to call it, witnessed the fact of Phil's body. It saw Phil's body and then back created a dream, or Phil subconsciously remembered it and wrote it in his book. Now, in the letter. Now, this again is extraordinary. This is again, people say, where is the evidence for my cheating the ferryman hypothesis? My argument is, it's everywhere. The problem is that nobody, because my writings are not that well known, people are not aware that I've already explained this. You know, in so many ways, the cheating the ferryman hypothesis really is supported by people's experiences, as well as the science, as well as the neurology, as well as the neurochemistry. It's supported by people's experiences, both subjective and objective. So that's another side with Philip K. Dick. But again, the reason I'm talking about Robert Nixon is that one of the things that Nixon was asked was that when he was asked about the end of the world and when the end of the world would take place. And he said that England would be invaded by men with ice on their helmets, which obviously somebody coming from the north or from Russia or whatever. And then he was asked, would there be anywhere safe? And he turned round and he said, when the end of the world shall come to be, the safest place will be God's holy acre twixt Mersey and Dee. And God's holy acre twixt Mersey and Dee is the Wirral Peninsula, which is where I was born, and where has been a theme through this number of books, through these a peek behind the curtain that I've been discussing. So I said in the very first version of my first book, which was never published because I had to adapt it because my publishers wanted me to change it, I had a section on this where I said that if nuclear war looks like it's going to happen and Russia looks like it's going to invade, I'm on my way back to Wirral as quickly as I possibly can, because obviously that's going to be safe. How Wirral could be safer than anywhere else, I don't know, particularly as the Wirral has a nuclear facility in the middle of it called Capenhurst, so I think it's probably highly unlikely. But you never know. Is developing news, which I will be putting more information out when I have the chance, is that my new book is supposedly out on Amazon on the 1st of November. But I've been in discussions with my publishers, and they have issues. They've got a new distributor at the moment. Their original distributor, I think, have gone out of business, so they need time to get the new distribution set up, which means that the book will not be out on the 1st of November, unlike advertised, and it will probably be early December now. But the good news is, this means that I can do what I did with my last book, and that is that I will be able to pre-order as many books as I like. And I can sell them before the book is in the bookshops or on Amazon. You can buy the books directly off me, which means you can get the book in advance and it will be signed and it will be numbered. Okay, so what I will be doing is I'll be discussing next week with my webmaster to design an additional page on my website where you can then, using PayPal, buy the book off the website before it is in the bookshops, so you can read it before it's been available to anybody, to other people. Now, the caveat here is that I'll only be charging the price that you will pay in a bookshop. I can't beat the price that Amazon will probably do it, but normal bookshop price, the price that the book is supposed to be sold at. But the problem will be is paying for postage, because postage these days is just ridiculous. And you will end up, if you're based in America or far afield from the United Kingdom, you'll end up paying nearly as much for the postage, if not more, than the book itself. But that's up to you. I'm not forcing anybody in any shape or form to do that. I'm also in negotiations about doing one, maybe two launch events in London and in the southeast, but I'm at very early stages on that, and they again probably will be in December or maybe January now. So check it out. The website is anthonypeake.com. So, you know, you guys will know about the website anyway, hopefully, and if not, really do check it out. And I'm linking all of these things I'm doing now to this. I'm also, in the next few weeks, I'm doing 3, I think, interviews for other channels as well, so there'll be a lot of material on there as well. So that's all for this time now. We've gone on for 50 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed my ramblings. No doubt you'll be checking up the facts as to whether my facts were right or wrong. Who knows? You know, at my age, my memory isn't what it used to be, but I don't really care. It's not the point. It's getting the ideas across and everything else as well, which is important to me. So thank you very much for listening in and watching. And please, please, please tell your friends about this. I'm trying to build a legacy here. And the more people that know about my work, the better. You don't have to buy my books. You know, you really don't. You can order them from your local library. You know, you can. They're available libraries. Even if your local library doesn't have a copy of them, your local area will. Your local state or your local county, and you can order them, or you can order them from the British Library. You know, you can get hold of the books, so please do. That's if you're in the UK, obviously, but I know that they're also in a number of libraries across the United States and university libraries as well. So thanks very much. Hope you enjoy it. Have a lovely 2 weeks before we meet again. So thank you very much for listening in. All the best. Bye bye.